Prager U thinks Israel's army is the world's most moral. Interesting. Again, leaving aside the idea that any modern state military could be considered moral, not necessarily saying they're immoral, but they're definitely not moral. Uh, let's see how Prager U justifies this. So, Prager U, take it away.
There are two views of the Israeli military, what you hear in most of the media and the truth. I'm going to tell you the truth. I was the commander of
Okay, commander of the British Army.
British forces in Afghanistan. I have fought in combat zones around the world, including Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Macedonia, and Iraq. I was also present throughout the conflict in Gaza in 2014. Based on my experience and on my observations, the Israel Defense Force, the IDF, does more to safeguard the rights of civilians in a combat zone than any other army in the history of warfare.
Wild. That is a wild claim. Okay. I mean, even if that is true, even if the IDF does whatever it can to secure civilians in war zones, which he's going to have to do some legwork on that. That doesn't change the fact that Israel is a borderline ethno-nationalist fascist state, and that their military is basically there to oppress the Palestinian and other Arab nation peoples in Israel because they can.
Why is this so? Firstly, Israel is a decent country with Western values run on
Western values. There's the dog whistle, yep. Israel is a decent country with Western values. Okay? So is the United States. So is England. So is Germany. For whatever value of Western values you choose.
democratic principles.
They have a veneer of democracy, but there isn't quite the universal suffrage or actual democracy present in Israel that they want you to believe.
Israel has no more interest in war than Belgium does. In fact, Israel has never started a war. The only reason it ever goes to war is to defend itself.
No, it definitely didn't invade Palestine. And what was that, the 7 Days War? Yeah, no, they definitely... Okay.
And it has
It's more of that Zionist propaganda there.
to defend itself, because unlike Belgium, it is surrounded by countries and armed groups that want to destroy it.
Conveniently leaving out that it's there because the United States led the world in deciding we should create a place for Israel to exist, and decided to put them literally in the middle of groups of people who have traditionally hated Jews for centuries. So, granted, there aren't too many places they could go, but it's telling that they chose to displace Arabs and other brown people rather than displace some good Europeans. What's up, Magmill? How's it going, man?
Secondly, Judaism, with its unsurpassed moral standards, remains a major influence on the citizens of Israel.
Unsurpassed moral standards. I mean, granted, Jews tend to be a little more progressive than other religions, but it's still a religion. Like, there's a lot of stuff Christians borrowed from Judaism that a lot of Jews don't like to talk about. So, yeah, I'm not sure this holds up.
I say this as a non-Jew. Thirdly, the army is composed overwhelmingly of citizen soldiers. Israel's a small country with a small professional army. To fight a war, it depends on its conscripts and its reservists. These are ordinary citizens, from professors to plumbers, called upon to defend their homes. They don't want to be fighting, and they don't want to harm others.
This is just the individual soldiers are regular people rhetoric. Yeah, we know. I don't have an issue with the individual soldiers in a given military. I have an issue with the military itself and the goals it's usually used for. This is irrelevant. The worst military. I'm sure there were plenty of, to just directly invoke Godwin's law, plenty of Nazis who were just good German folk who didn't want to be fighting. They wanted to, be home with their beer and schnitzels. But, the Nazi party Hitler himself and the Nazi party in general were very good at stoking fears of being destroyed by the Jews and by outside powers. Also, their graphics technology really shows how much it's changed over the last 5 years. But yeah, it's not the individual soldiers. And again, given the way most armies operate, where the individual soldier has no more thinking power than the bullets in his gun, that's not a slight on soldiers. That's what they're trained to do and be. But given that, the individual soldiers being just normal folks doesn't change how the army operates. They're not trained to think for themselves, so they don't think for themselves. There are obvious exceptions, but that's generally how they operate.
Nowhere was the essential morality and decency of the IDF more evident than in the Gaza war of 2014. If ever there was a purely defensive war, this was it. The war was started by Hamas, the terror organization, designated as such by the US State Department that runs the Gaza Strip. In the first 6 months of 2014, Hamas launched hundreds of rockets at Israeli civilians. After repeated warnings from Israel to stop, the Israeli Air Force finally conducted precision strikes to halt the rocket fire. And the
Hamas is kind of a complex, complex issue, because ultimately they are trying to win back the land that the Israelis took from the Palestinians, like back in the 70s, I believe. And they're doing so in the only way they can, by making it hostile for the Israelis to stay there. Unfortunately, the Israelis have U.S. backing. So, for all intents and purposes, the Israeli ability to make war and rebuild from Hamas, make war on and rebuild from Hamas, is bottomless. So, Hamas has done some terrible things, but Israel's also pretty shit. So it's kind of definitely a douche sandwich and a turd burger choice.
The IDF advanced into Gaza to destroy a network of terror tunnels that Hamas had constructed to attack Israeli communities near the Gaza border. The IDF took extraordinary measures to give Gaza civilians notice of targeted areas, dropping millions of leaflets, broadcasting radio messages, sending texts, and making tens of thousands of phone calls.
It's worth noting that they did this over a very small area where half the battle is an ideological one between the Hamas, who are just trying to retake their homeland, and... Thank you for the follow, Dr. Scrubs. Appreciate it. And the Israelis, who are ostensibly just trying to defend their land. So by broadcasting this information to the Gaza area, you basically give the impression to the regular people living there that Hamas doesn't care about civilian casualties, but the Israelis do. Now, how much the Hamas cares about civilian casualties really, unfortunately, depends on what kind of civilians we're talking about. After all, if your goal is to demoralize and uh, try to beat down the Israeli government in order to get them off your land, killing Israeli civilians is one way to do that. But and again, Hamas has been pretty ruthless in their goals. But that's not to say that their goal is necessarily a bad one.
Let me repeat that. The Israelis called Gazans on their cell phones and told them to leave their residences and move to safety. Never in the history of warfare has an army phoned its enemy.
Also worth noting that this means that anyone who stays behind can be treated as an enemy combatant. Because if you've ostensibly evacuated all of the innocent civilians, anyone staying behind would necessarily be siding with Hamas. So you don't have to discriminate in targets if you've told yourself and the world that you've given ample notice to any innocent civilians to evacuate. So it could be less that they're worried about innocent civilians and more that they just want to have a free fire zone.
And told them where they're going to drop their bombs. Many IDF missions that could have taken out Hamas military capabilities were aborted to prevent civilian casualties, increasing the risk to Israeli citizens and soldiers. Despite all of this, of course innocent civilians were killed. Every war is chaotic and confusing, and mistakes are frequent. But mistakes are not war crimes. Hamas, on the other hand, committed war crimes as official government policy. Hamas deliberately positioned its military assets among the civilian population, hiding weapons in schools and hospitals, and placing rocket launchers alongside apartment buildings, then forced those civilians to stay in areas they knew would be attacked. They also instructed their people to report the lie.
I mean, yeah. If you've got such asymmetrical warfare, you use whatever means are at your disposal. Because either the Israelis bomb the civilian targets, knowing they're civilian targets, or they leave them alone. I mean, again, I'm not saying Hamas is good, Israel bad, but I'm not saying Hamas is, the worst either. Just because they've done some pretty heinous things in pursuit of their goal doesn't mean their goal is bad. And basically, it's a game of chicken. Are you going to blow up civilians in order to, destroy our stockpiles? How is that going to look? There's a reason why Israel keeps going on about Hamas using civilian shields. Because it's how they protect their stuff.
That every Gazan killed was a civilian, even if they were actually fighters. And if there were no civilian deaths.
Yeah, exactly, Magmill, yep. If you think we didn't do the same thing Hamas is doing in, Viet Cong did the same thing in Vietnam. They used civilians to hide themselves. When you're dealing with an outsized power, you have to do what it takes. And depending, we kind of have to analyze what their goals are. In the case of Israel, it's literally just taking land that doesn't belong to them. I mean, we can quibble over land belonging to people. But the fact is that the Palestinians just want to live peacefully, and the Israelis don't allow that. So they respond violently.
Deaths, Hamas made them up. Numerous internet sites show Palestinians elaborately staging sniper victims and smashed ambulances, among other phony horrors. It's so common, there's even a term for it, Pallywood, as in Palestinian Hollywood. Ironically, it's the leaders of Hamas themselves who best understand the extraordinary measures the IDF will take to protect innocent civilians. They take full advantage of Israel's decency and adherence to the laws of war. No army takes such risks in order to protect civilians as the Israeli army does. I say this as a professional soldier. I say it because it's true, and people who care about truth should know it. I'm Colonel Rich.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know about that Pallywood stuff. That's something I had not heard of, but again, they're trying to carve out a space for their people to live. And since Israel seems wholly uninterested in a peaceful solution, violence it is. Yeah. He failed to prove his claims of Israel being the most moral army, because what is morality in war but what the victor claims it is? And right now, it has to be said that Israel controls most of the narrative here. No one listens to Hamas because Hamas has been blacklisted by the U.S., and the U.S. is the voice on this subject. So anything Hamas puts out is a terror, is the words of terrorists, and terrorists obviously can't be believed. But just look into what their goals are and what they're trying to achieve, and sometimes, things aren't always as they seem. Israel is carrying out genocide. That's true as well. Yes, Israel is not at war. They're carrying out a genocide on the Arab Palestinian people. Just because they don't, Magmel is saying here, just because they don't carry out their genocide super hard on women and children is not an indication that the activity itself is just. So yes, absolutely true, Magmel. Thank you for that. So yeah, failed to prove that Israel's army is the most just, and even if what he claimed was true, it would still not make Israel's actions in Palestine just. So, failure on every count, as usual for Prager U. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the show. Remember to like, share, and leave a comment because it helps me. Subscribe and ring that bell to help you. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.